Nyandira was a city of wealth and power, where tall buildings kissed the sky and expensive cars roared through the streets. But inside one grand house, hidden behind golden gates, a young girl lay shivering on a cold, hard floor. Eshe woke up to the sound of raindrops dripping from the cracked ceiling. A chill ran through her body as she pulled the thin, torn blanket tighter around her shoulders. The kitchen smelled of freshly baked bread and roasted meat, but none of it was for her. Her stomach grumbled, but she had learned to ignore hunger. The door slammed open, and Aisha's sharp voice sliced through the darkness. "Wake up, lazy girl. I want these floors shining before sunrise." Eshe scrambled to her feet, her heart pounding. She knew better than to argue. 1 second of delay could earn her a slap or worse. Her parents had died when she was little, leaving her with no one except her uncle, Baba Juma. He was rich, powerful, and respected by many. When he took her in, she thought she had found a home, but she was wrong. Instead of love, she was given orders. Instead of kindness, she received cruelty. Instead of a bed, she was thrown onto the kitchen floor like an unwanted pet. She wasn't treated like family. She was treated like a servant. Days turned into weeks, weeks into years. Aisha and her daughter, Zalika, lived like queens, wearing expensive dresses and eating the finest meals. Eshe, on the other hand, scrubbed floors until her hands bled. She washed mountains of dishes, did endless laundry, and served food she was never allowed to taste. "You're worthless," Zalika sneered one evening, tossing her dirty shoes at Eshe's feet. "Clean them properly this time." Eshe clenched her jaw and picked up the shoes. She wanted to throw them back at Zalika, but she knew the punishment would be brutal. Instead, she lowered her head and continued scrubbing. At night, when the house was quiet, she would lie awake, staring at the ceiling. Was this her life forever? A servant in a house where no one loved her. She dreamed of running away, of finding a better life. But where would she go? She had no money, no friends, no family. She was trapped. One evening, as she knelt on the cold floor, scrubbing the dining hall tiles, a shadow moved beside her. Mama Fatu, the old housemaid, leaned down and pressed something into Eshe's hand. A small, worn-out book. "This is a guide on real estate," Mama Fatu whispered. "If you ever get a chance, learn from it. Knowledge is power, my dear." Eshe's fingers tightened around the book. It was forbidden for her to read. If Aisha found out, she would rip it apart and punish Eshe for even daring to hold it. But something stirred inside her, a tiny spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this book was her way out. Nyandira was alive with music and laughter that evening. The grand dining hall of Baba Juma's mansion glowed under golden chandeliers, the long table covered in silverware and expensive dishes. The smell of roasted lamb and saffron rice filled the air as guests in fine clothes sipped wine and exchanged stories of wealth and success. Among them sat Mr. Tunde, a powerful property investor whose approval meant everything to Baba Juma. Eshe moved silently between the guests, balancing a heavy tray in her trembling hands. Her back ached, her feet burned, but she had learned to push past the pain. She placed a dish before Mr. Tunde, careful not to spill a single drop. Across the table, Zalika lounged in her silk dress, laughing loudly at a joke. She barely acknowledged Eshe's presence until disaster struck. With a careless flick of her wrist, Zalika knocked over her glass of juice. The bright red liquid splashed across her dress. A hush fell over the table. For a moment, Eshe froze. She hadn't done anything wrong, but she knew what was coming. "You idiot!" Zalika shrieked, leaping to her feet. "Look what you've done!" Before Eshe could react, Zalika grabbed a glass of water and hurled it straight into her face. The icy splash hit her skin, soaking her dress, dripping onto the floor. The room exploded with laughter. The rich men, their wives, even the servants watching from the corner, everyone was laughing. Eshe stood there, water running down her face, her hands clenched at her sides. The humiliation burned deep, but she didn't move. She didn't cry, not anymore. Baba Juma cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. He forced a smile at Mr. Tunde. "Forgive the disturbance. Just a useless girl who doesn't know her place." Eshe looked at him then, her uncle, the man who was supposed to protect her, the man who had stolen her childhood and turned her into a servant. Something inside her snapped. Later that night, the house was silent, but Eshe knew it was coming. She sat in the corner of the kitchen, knees drawn to her chest, still damp from the water Zalika had thrown at her. Her heart pounded as she heard the footsteps. Baba Juma stood over her, his expression cold. "You embarrass me in front of my guests," he said. "I won't tolerate it anymore." Eshe appeared beside him, her lips curled in disgust. "She's useless," she spat. "It's time to get rid of her." Eshe barely had time to react before rough hands grabbed her arms. Zalika and Eshe dragged her across the marble floor, through the grand hall where she had spent years scrubbing away the footprints of people who never cared she existed. The front doors swung open. Cold night air hit her like a slap. "Get out!" Zalika sneered, shoving Eshe onto the stone steps. Eshe landed hard, scraping her hands. Eshe tossed a small bag after her, her only belongings, a few tattered clothes, and nothing else. "Sleep outside, like the stray you are." Zalika laughed, slamming the door shut. The mansion's golden lights glowed behind the iron gates, but for Eshe, the night was nothing but darkness. The street was empty. No one would help her. She sat there, knees to her chest, shivering in the cold. She had nothing, no home, no food, no future. But as she stared up at the sky, the same thought echoed in her mind. They think they've won. They think I'm finished. But I am not. The streets of Nyandira were cruel to those who had no home. Eshe walked with her arms wrapped around herself, her stomach empty, her body weak from exhaustion. The nights were the worst, cold, long, and filled with the distant sounds of the city that had moved on without her. People passed by, not sparing her a glance. She had become invisible. She found shelter in abandoned buildings, crumbling and forgotten, just like her. Sometimes, she curled up in alleyways, hidden in shadows where no one would see her. The hunger clawed at her insides, but she refused to beg. She would not lower herself to that. Every night, when the city quieted, she reached for the only possession she had left, Mama Fatu's book. Under the dim flicker of streetlights, she turned the fragile pages, her fingers tracing the words. Land, ownership, investments. These words meant power. She didn't fully understand them yet, but she was determined to learn. The book spoke of wealth not earned through luck, but through knowledge. The rich controlled land, and land controlled everything. If she could understand this, maybe, just maybe, she could carve a place for herself in a world that had discarded her. She read until her eyes burned with exhaustion, absorbing everything. The words became her lifeline, her weapon, her secret hope. One afternoon, she sat on the worn steps of an old marketplace, the book balanced on her lap. Her lips moved silently as she read, completely absorbed. A shadow fell over her. "Where did you get that book?" Eshe looked up, startled. A man stood before her, tall and well-dressed, his sharp eyes studying her with curiosity. She hesitated. Most people ignored her. Some were cruel. But this man, he was different. "An old friend gave it to me," she said cautiously. He crouched down, eyeing the book. "Do you understand it?" Eshe straightened. "I'm learning," she said, her voice firm. The man nodded, impressed. "Most people don't bother with books like these. But you're reading this in the streets. That means something." She didn't know what to say. No one had ever spoken to her like that before. "My name is Kamari," he said. "I own a small real estate office. If you're serious about learning, I can give you a chance. But I don't do charity. You'll have to work for it. A chance." She felt something stir inside her, something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. "I'll do anything," she said without hesitation. Kamari studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Be at my office tomorrow morning. Don't be late." Eshe clutched the book to her chest as she watched him walk away. Tomorrow. For the first time in a long time, she had somewhere to go. The office was nothing grand. A small, cluttered space with stacks of old files, a desk covered in papers, and a coffee machine that barely worked. But to Eshe, it was a kingdom. She started at the bottom. Her job was simple. Run errands, file papers, make endless cups of tea. But she didn't complain. She watched. She listened. She learned. She studied the way Kamari spoke to clients, how he negotiated deals, how he calculated risks. She memorized every word, every strategy. At night, she stayed late, reading through old contracts, tracing every transaction. She had no formal education, but she had something better, an unshakable will. Kamari noticed. One evening, He placed a thick file on her desk. "Tell me what you see," he said. Eshe opened the file, scanning the numbers, the terms, the agreements. She frowned, flipping through the pages. "This deal is bad," she said finally. Kamari raised an eyebrow. "Why?" "The land is overpriced, and the seller is desperate. If you wait a little longer, you can get it for less." Silence. Then Kamari grinned. "You're learning," he said. From that day on, he gave her more responsibility. She started handling small deals, speaking to clients, negotiating prices. She worked tirelessly, saving every coin she earned. She never spent on luxuries, only food, rent for a tiny room, and books on real estate. Years passed. One day she stood before a worn-out building in the outskirts of Nyandira. It was nothing special. Cracked walls, broken windows, but to Eshe, it was everything. It was hers, her first property. She had saved enough to buy it, negotiating fiercely for the lowest price. It wasn't much, but it was a start. She rented it out, using the money to buy another, then another, brick by brick, deal by deal. She built her empire. The girl they had thrown away like trash was rising, and one day she would return, not as a beggar, but as a force to be reckoned with. The sun hung low over Nyandira, casting golden light across the city's skyline. Expensive cars cruised the streets, their polished surfaces reflecting the wealth and power of those who owned them. Among them, a sleek black car pulled up in front of a grand estate. The door opened, and a woman stepped out, dressed in an elegant white suit, her heels clicking against the pavement. Eshe had returned. The girl who had once been discarded like trash now stood tall, her presence commanding attention. She was no longer the weak, broken girl who slept on kitchen floors. She was Eshe Mwana, the most feared and respected landowner in Nyandira. She walked toward the office of her property management firm, where a stack of tenant applications waited for her review. As she flipped through the pages, a familiar name caught her eye. Aisha Juma. Her hand stilled. She read further. The application was not just from Aisha. It was also from Zalika. A slow, cold smile spread across Eshe's lips. Fate had a cruel sense of humor. Years ago, Aisha and Zalika had forced her to sleep on the cold floor, treating her worse than a stray dog. Now, they had lost everything. Baba Juma's business had collapsed under debt and mismanagement. The family that once lived in luxury had been thrown out onto the streets, struggling to find shelter. And now, they had come to her. Eshe leaned back in her chair, running her fingers over the expensive wood of her desk. She had dreamed of this moment, imagined it 1,000 times in the darkest corners of her heart. She pressed the intercom button. Send them in. Moments later, the door opened, and 2 familiar figures stepped inside. Aisha was thinner now, her once proud posture reduced to one of quiet desperation. Zalika, who had once walked with the arrogance of a queen, now looked small and uncertain. Neither of them had recognized Eshe's name on the lease. "Good afternoon," Eshe greeted smoothly, her voice as calm as still water. Aisha gave a polite, nervous smile. We're here about the house for rent." Eshe gestured to the chairs in front of her desk. "Sit." They obeyed, their eyes darting around the room, taking in the grandeur. Everything about the place screamed wealth: the marble floors, the gold-accented furniture, the large window overlooking the city. Eshe picked up their application. "You need a place to stay?" Aisha nodded quickly. "Yes, we've had some difficulties. We lost our home." Eshe turned her sharp gaze on Zalika, who had been silent this whole time. "Do you remember me?" Eshe asked, her voice soft. Zalika frowned. "What?" Eshe leaned forward, resting her chin on her hand. "Look at me closely." Zalika's eyes scanned Eshe's face, confusion flickering in her gaze. Then, it hit her. The color drained from her face. "No," she whispered. Aisha turned to Zalika. "What's wrong?" Zalika's mouth opened and closed, as if struggling to breathe. Her fingers dug into the arms of the chair. "Eshe!" Aisha stiffened. Her eyes snapped back to Eshe, looking at her properly for the first time. The same girl they had beaten, insulted, and thrown onto the streets now sat before them, dressed in power, surrounded by wealth. "Yes," Eshe said smoothly. "I'm the landlady now." The room fell into stunned silence. Aisha's face twisted in shock. Eshe cut her off with a raised hand. Tell me, Eshe, what is it like to have nowhere to go? Aisha's hands trembled in her lap. Zalika's lips pressed together, her usual arrogance shattered. Eshe exhaled slowly, as if savoring the moment. The past threatened to rise within her. The years of humiliation, the nights she spent shivering in the streets, the countless times she had swallowed her pain just to survive. You made me sleep on the floor, Eshe said, her voice eerily calm. Do you remember? Aisha flinched. You threw me out in the cold. Eshe continued, her fingers tapping against the desk. Treated me like filth. Zalika's eyes glistened with tears. Eshe, please. We had no choice. Baba Juma, I don't care, Eshe snapped, her voice like ice. You had a choice. You could have helped me. You could have treated me like family, but you chose cruelty. Aisha swallowed hard. We were wrong, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. We need a place to stay. We have nothing. Eshe studied them, letting the silence stretch. A part of her wanted to reject them, to throw them out onto the streets the same way they had done to her, let them taste the humiliation, the suffering. But Eshe was not them. She stood, walking around the desk until she stood before them. I will rent you the house, she said finally, but on my terms. Aisha and Zalika nodded quickly. Anything, Aisha whispered. You will clean the house yourself, Eshe said. You will do the chores. No maids, no luxuries. Zalika opened her mouth to protest, but Eshe raised an eyebrow, daring her to speak. You will sleep on the floor, Eshe added, for 1 year. Aisha gasped. Eshe, please. Did I stutter? Eshe asked, tilting her head. Tears filled Aisha's eyes, but she lowered her head in defeat. We'll do it. Eshe nodded, satisfaction curling in her chest. Good. She turned to leave, then paused at the door. You once told me I was worthless, she said, glancing over her shoulder. Do you still believe that? Aisha shook her head furiously. Number you. You are powerful, Eshe. Zalika couldn't even look at her. Eshe smirked. I know. She walked away, leaving them sitting there, broken. Her revenge was complete, not through cruelty, but through power. They would never forget her name, and neither would the world. The evening breeze swept through the city of Nyandira, carrying the hum of life below. The skyline shimmered with lights, tall buildings standing as monuments to ambition and power. Atop the highest of them, a lone figure stood on a grand balcony, gazing down at the world she now ruled. Eshe Moana, dressed in an ivory gown, her hair cascading over her shoulders, she looked like a queen surveying her kingdom. But she had no crown, no throne. Her power wasn't inherited. It was earned, carved from the very suffering that once sought to break her. Far below, in a modest house, Aisha and Zalika lived quietly, no longer arrogant, no longer cruel, just two women who had learned the bitter lessons of life. They were no longer homeless. Eshe had given them a place to stay, not out of kindness, not out of vengeance, but because she wanted them to understand something deeper. True victory wasn't in watching them suffer. It wasn't in reducing them to nothing. No, the true victory was in knowing that they would wake up every day, living under a roof owned by the very girl they had once tossed aside. They would never forget. Eshe took a deep breath, letting the air fill her lungs. She had conquered the city, but more importantly, she had conquered her past. She turned away from the view, stepping back into the warmth of her mansion. The past was over. The future belonged to her. Eshe's story is proof that no matter how low they push you, you can rise higher than they ever imagined. Life isn't about revenge. It's about proving them wrong by winning. Want more stories of resilience, power, and transformation? Click on the videos on your screen and keep watching. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button. Your journey to greatness starts now.